Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Gallery Teachers Masterclass. My name is Neil Harris, and the title of today's session is Scaling the Highlands, Tackling the Fear of Teaching Advanced Level Learners. As you can see from this slide, I've divided today's masterclass into 4 areas. I'd like to begin by looking at this concept of the proficient learner. What actually does it mean to be, and to use the common term, an advanced learner of English? I'll then move on to consider the role of the needs analysis. Now, if any of you teach one-to-one learners, you'll be very familiar, I'm sure, with the needs analysis. But I actually suggest that the needs analysis is a tool that we can use not just with one-to-one, but also with group learners in order to get to know them and to understand their motivations, their needs, and their wants. And that leads into the third, and in some respects, the bulk of today's masterclass, where we look at ways in which we can meet the needs of, in particular, the highest level, the C2 Proficient learner. And I'll introduce some ideas around syllabus design and how I believe that has an important role in terms of decisions about what, how we teach. And then, of course, at the end, I'll draw some conclusions. So without further ado, let's move on to section 1, looking at the role of the proficient learner and an overview of what they're like. I think it's actually quite useful. And when I was planning this session, the first question that came to my mind, I didn't have an answer, was how many learners of English are there around the world? And how many of them have actually reached that C1, C2 advanced proficient level? More about the words advanced and proficient in a moment. It is incredibly difficult to calculate the number of speakers of English. Attempts have been made, and no one really has come up with a definitive response. We can see from the screen the world population, and we can see as part of that the overall number of people speaking English. But of course, it's very important, isn't it, to define our terms. What does speaking English actually mean? I think it's enough for today's presentation, masterclass, to make the point that the number of people who speak English as an additional language far, far, far outstrips the number of the so-called native speakers, those who have it as a first language. And if you look at the number towards the bottom of the screen here, the overall number of people speaking English as a first language, and this is based on research published by David Crystal in 2018, you'll see there is a mind-bogglingly large number, 388 million overall speakers of English. But how many of them are at that really high level? And actually, what does that really high level mean? Let's find out. So, the next couple of slides aim to answer those 2 questions. How many C2 speakers are there? And I have data for that from one of the exam boards. But also, perhaps more interestingly, what characterizes a proficient user of English? Now, you'll notice that until this point, I have used both the term advanced and proficient. Advanced, I think, is a rough and ready term that was really very familiar with language teachers and maybe even learners, and is still current today. We hear about people talking about learners who are elementary, intermediate, upper intermediate, advanced. But of note, if we look at the CEFR, the Common European Framework of Reference of Languages, which aims to identify the characteristics of learners, looking at a range of languages within Europe, then we see that, in fact, the term proficient is used. And in fact, that proficient user category is divided into 2 parts, C1 and C2. You'll see, and if you are watching this video at a later date, you'll be able to pause in order to look in more detail at the information that exists on screen. I think it'll be useful to have a look at what this actually means in terms of the different English language exams which exist around the world. And here they are. Notice that the C2 mastery level is taken up by IELTS 8 and higher. Now, the highest band in IELTS, and this is an exam that will be familiar with many globally, goes up to the highest level of 9. Whereas the Cambridge Proficiency exam, and I'll talk quite a lot about that later, in fact goes higher up until the highest levels of 220. That's the maximum score on that level that is available. So even exams which have a sense of comparability do in fact represent slightly different levels of linguistic competence, particularly when we get to the very highest levels of the Cambridge C2 exam. Now, if we look at the handbook for Cambridge C2 Proficiency, it tells us that it is a qualification that shows the world that you have, quote, mastered English to an exceptional level. It proves that you can communicate with fluency and sophistication of a highly competent English speaker. And I think this quotation is useful and important in 2 ways. Number one, it shows that you have reached an exceptional level, and therefore we can expect the number of speakers globally who have reached this level to be relatively small. Although, of course, within the teaching community, it's probably disproportionately large. Secondly, notice this reference at the end to a highly competent English speaker. We are not saying that proficiency is the same as a native level. Rather, we are saying it is the sophistication of a highly competent English speaker. Therefore, global speakers of English, for whom English was not their first language, but also native speakers of English who also use the language in a sophisticated way. Believe you me, not every native speaker speaks in a sophisticated manner. So if we try to break this down, you'll see here the 4 strips, which refer to some of the domains within which a C2 level may be beneficial and will operate. So the first one is academic, study. Notice here reference to postgraduate and PhD programs. Number 2, the business use of English. And here C2 enables you to be able to negotiate and persuade effectively at a senior management level, at least linguistically, because there are other skills involved in successful negotiation and persuasion, soft skills. It enables the C2 user to be able to understand the main ideas of a complex piece of writing. This may well be an academic text or a highly complex business text. And then finally, the ability to talk about complex or sensitive issues, and therefore the kind of language that one might expect of people working in high-level international politics and diplomacy. So in an attempt to try to kind of get a sense of scale, this slide, based on data from Cambridge, tries to identify the relative number of candidates taking C2 compared with all the other English language tests that Cambridge offers. And Cambridge, and this is data based on 2021 information, has about 6.1 million test takers each year. The B2 level, and for those of you who have been around as long as I have, may be familiar with the old terminology of first certificate, now B2 first, that's taken by around 270,000 candidates. Whereas C2, that highest of the 2 proficient levels in the CFR, is taken by about 45,000 candidates in 80 different countries. But interestingly, the pass rates, I think, are surprisingly high, possibly because these are very highly motivated, determined, and already successful language learners. They've made it to C1 and above. So there's something like a 75% success rate in the exam. Remember, this is Cambridge C2, not all proficiency level exams. And of those 75% who pass, 10% get the highest grade, grade A, and a further 25% get grade B. So we can say, therefore, that the number of people who take and pass C2 are a very small fraction of the number of people who take exams, which in turn is a very small fraction of the number of people who, in that 388 billion, 388 million there, that would have been a very big figure, who are able to speak English to some degree. That is not to in any way diminish the importance of people at this level. We need those people to carry out politics, diplomacy, peacekeeping as a really important role of highly proficient speakers of English, as well as, of course, us teachers and our learners who want to do it. So let's move the focus now away from looking at the characteristics and the number of learners to start thinking about what happens when we actually have a group of students, one or more, in front of us, and how we can actually decide how to go about developing their learning. Notice I focus on their learning rather than their teaching. And I do that deliberately because for me, the role of the teacher at any stage of a learner's journey is not to talk more than the learner. We heard about that in the last session, the last masterclass offered by Steve Hirschhorn. But rather what we're doing is looking at how we as teachers facilitate learning, which may involve some teaching, but it's more about what the learners do. And if we're interested in what the learners do and how to help them to do it better, I think there is no better tool than a needs analysis. Why do we need them, though? What are they for? Let's find out. So I think whenever you meet a group of students or an individual student for the first time, the challenge, the problem, is identifying what will be appropriate content for their course. Now, that might sound like teaching. It will become clear as we go into syllabus design that this is also crucially important for setting up learning contexts. And I want to make the point yet again, although we're here today to be talking about high-level learners, advanced proficient learners, the needs analysis can and indeed should be used at any level for any course type and any class size. It's mostly associated with business English and ESP, English for specific purposes. But I actually think that, in that first meeting with your students, during getting to know, there is a degree of needs analysis taking place. We as the teachers are perhaps attending to what the students are saying, what they're avoiding saying because they haven't got the language yet, and indeed what they're saying, but we can help them to improve. So yes, getting to know you is a very informal slant on an informal take on needs analysis. But in fact, we probably need to go further because, as I say in the bottom of this slide, one size does not fit all. And if you've got two classes at the same level, they're not going to be the same. They're not going to respond in the same way. And indeed, what and how you facilitate their learning, or indeed how you teach them and what you teach them, will differ. So the needs analysis, and this is a definition from the British Council website, it involves doing some kind of activity. Notice, therefore, it's a broad definition with a learner or learners in order to find out what their learning needs are. Now, from the next slide, you see that I extend needs to the idea also of wants. Let's have a look. So for me, the needs analysis is a solution to that problem of identifying the what, the how of what happens in classrooms. It enables us to create a tailored response to what we find out about our different learners. And they're represented by these cute little figures, which appear at the top of the screen. And I have one here as well. And it's on my desk to remind me that every learner is different and every learner deserves to be recognized as an individual with particular needs. And of course, because they're there and they are able to communicate it, their desires, what they're interested in, why they're interested, what they want to be able to do better. So needs analysis for me considers a number of areas. It should include a discussion about previous study experiences. What have you studied? Where have you studied it? How did you study it? Was there a particular teacher whose work made learning particularly effective for you as an individual? Of course, we're involved in this. We'll be able to identify their needs, things that they perhaps should be able to do better, or things that they can't really express particularly well at this stage. But we also really importantly need to consider the context. In other words, where is the learner using English now? Where will the learner be using English and with whom in the future? Because if they're going to be studying English with the purpose of coming to the UK, that is quite different from someone who is, I believe, learning English to participate in international business meetings where there are no English speakers present. And to flesh that out very briefly, the learner in contact with other speakers of English who are native speakers may need to have a greater understanding of highly idiomatic language that may well be less a feature of the language of the international user of English. And then finally, at the end, we have individuals here. What do they want? What will motivate them? What do they want to be able to do better at the end of this process? Because if we can help them to achieve that, we will maintain their motivation. So the next couple of slides I'll work through quite quickly. But to make the point that the what of needs analysis is really how we structure the format of a needs analysis interview, if indeed one takes place. The one you can see on screen, I've taken this from a Google search, is in fact an ESP needs analysis for university students, and therefore will differ quite significantly from if you're working with someone who has a very specific functional requirement. I know of a learner who a friend of mine is teaching, who is a housekeeper in a big country house, and therefore is looking after the staff, is looking after making sure the children are okay, and so on. So obviously the English for academic study has nothing to do with the needs of this particular housekeeper. But also for needs analysis, let's not forget the when. And it doesn't, I think, when it's done really well, happen just when the student arrives. We may involve the student, particularly on one-to-one, with an initial needs analysis before they leave home to find out the broad areas that they're interested in. So with a business person, you might find out, is it presentations, negotiations, meetings? And then when they arrive, you get in more detail contextually. How long are their presentations? What kind of presentations are they? Who are they presenting to? Perhaps most importantly, remember with needs analysis that this is a dynamic process. It doesn't end once you've done the needs analysis on day one. It is dynamic. It changes as the needs and wants of the learner develop during the course. So I think it's important to check in with learners on a regular basis. Are you happy to continue doing what we looked at? Has your focus changed? Is there something you'd like more of or less of? And then at the end, to review with the learner, what actually did they learn and did it meet their goals? And that's value for the learner, can be very motivating, but it's also important for the institution to know whether it's actually doing what it is asked to do. Now, you might think, as my examples so far have been largely to do with business, that this is actually all about teaching individual business learners. No, it's not. I taught for many years proficiency courses in the UK, and I actually would check in with my learners every Friday to refine what would happen the following week. It's called the negotiated syllabus. And we go through a list of grammar, vocabulary, reading, writing, listening, speaking, pronunciation, functional language. And I'd ask them, compared with this week, would you like more or less than they've had in the week of that Friday? And that would enable me to tweak the material and tweak the learning in order for them to maintain their motivation and have a sense of agency in their learning process. So yes, this is very much for groups. It is very much for all levels, and it can take place at lower levels in L1 instead of English. Finally, I think it's also important to touch on the who of the needs analysis. So, of course, it's going to be about the learner, the dark green circle at the top. Notice the use of the word situated. And by that, I mean taking into account their current and their desired use of English in the future, where and with whom and for what purpose. But we also need to consider in the needs analysis that we as the teacher have a role to play. We may, based on our expertise and also our beliefs, layer into that process certain things that the learner is less able or unable to identify. So we may, for example, know that there is a particular piece of language if a student is going forward for a C2 exam, and I think a lot of them do, that they may not have identified as being a need or a want, but actually, for the purpose of the exam, becomes important. So that also links into the teacher having an understanding of, for example, test requirements. But as a teacher, we might also identify that there is something in the pronunciation of the learner that doesn't sound absolutely natural. And we may then say, well, based on my belief that this learner is going to be working in the UK as a lawyer, that actually we want to help the learner to get as close as possible in all respects to a native-like norm. Whereas if they're working internationally, and here, for example, I could give Arsene Wenger as a case in point. Arsene Wenger has extraordinary C2 level English, but pronunciation-wise, he's not native-like. There is something remarkably French about his intonation patterns. But if we know that Arsene Wenger doesn't, that the pronunciation he has is not going to affect the way in which he is perceived within the world of football, makes it a different situation from that of an international lawyer. And I know a lot of international lawyers really do get told, for right or for wrong, you have an accent, you need to get rid of it. I've touched on external factors already, for example, test requirements, because it's all well and good preparing a student to be a C2 learner, and we're going to look at that in the next section. But if they are going to be taking a test, we need to make sure that they get the best chance of taking that test, as well as developing their language skills holistically. But we also need to consider that possibly there is someone who's paying for their course, and we need to respect that and to incorporate that into the learning and teaching context. Plus, of course, work requirements. If someone is paying themselves for a course to enable them to do a particular function in the workplace better, it might be to give good presentations, then clearly we need to take into account what a good presentation means, both for that individual student, but also for their audience. So that is our relatively quick view of needs analysis. And just to remind you, it's there because I think it's very important that we consider that the more information that we have about the learner or learners in our one-to-one or group classes, what they need, what they want, the added layer of the expertise that we bring as their teacher, the better able we are to make their learning journey as fulfilling as possible. So I'm now going to move on to the next part of the session, which is called Meeting the Needs of Advanced Learners, Course Design and Materials. And in that section, I'm going to do two things. We'll look together at course design, or more particularly at the way in which syllabus design might influence the courses that the students participate in. And we'll also look at two really quite different ways of thinking about reaching those C2 level goals in terms of very different types of learning material. But before we get into that, I'd like to address the issue that I spoke about at the beginning of the session, and that is this question of the fear that some teachers experience, regardless of their L1 background, when it comes to teaching at the highest level, C1, and I think even more so at C2. Now, I'm a teacher with 30 years experience. I happen by sheer coincidence that I was born in the UK. I'm educated to post-degree level, so I'm probably one of those L1 native speakers that has a sophisticated command of English. But interestingly, when I started teaching English, the bit of advice I received on the last day of my teaching course was, don't teach exam classes, don't teach high-level C2 classes for at least 2 years. And I still, to this day, have a certain degree of sympathy with that position, because throwing people at the deep end in something as rich, as fulfilling, but also linguistically as complex as C2, and also C2 exam preparation, is such that it's useful to have a good foundation of a couple of years of experience in order to make the transfer into exam teaching and very high level teaching. But I also recognize that not everyone has that luxury. Some people are just thrown into a classroom at any level. And I also believe that teaching beginners, and particularly that small number of true beginners that are still out there, also requires particular skills that often our training courses don't give enough of. So, in other words, there is this question of, am I good enough? Now, for a lot of teachers that I've spoken to, they measure themselves against the CEFR, that Common European Framework of Reference. But I also want to make the point that for teaching generally, language proficiency is not the sole, nor should it be necessarily the main indicator of teaching competence. There are many other measurements of teacher expertise, teacher competence that are much, much greater. And as in a conversation I was having with a Greek teacher of English who has written materials for C2, she also makes the point very strongly, just because you're a native speaker doesn't make you a C2 speaker. And it certainly doesn't make you the kind of person who would have the language knowledge in order to be able to help people to pass a C2 exam, or indeed reach a C2 level generally. Let's not deny the fact that the C2 level, the teacher really does require an incredibly high level of English themselves. And that, I think, comes out from the importance of being able to help with emergent language. But I really think it's necessary to start this section by saying native is not best. And if you have any sense of imposter syndrome because you are not a native teacher of English, please get rid of that if you can as soon as possible by valuing the other skills that you have, which combined with the very high level of language that you are required to have to be able to teach successfully at C2 level, will make you that really good teacher. Okay, so let's move on. And you might be thinking, has Neil gone mad? I've got a picture of a mandala and I've got a picture of some Lego. What on earth is this all about? I'd like to focus on the holistic nature of what we can see on the left-hand side. This is a system in balance. This is a system that is in harmony. Whereas on the right-hand side, we've got lots of little bricks. And this aims at identifying, for me, two different types of syllabus, the analytic and the synthetic one. Now, let me explain what I mean in terms of thinking about what happens in different types of classroom. In some classrooms, communicative success is prize over everything. The focus is not necessarily on the individual bits of accurate language that the users deploy in order to achieve a task. It might be a ranking task, which, here are some items of clothing, which are the most useful for someone going on a summer holiday or going to the Arctic. But it focuses rather on the ability to achieve the task, to make that ranked list with explanations and justifications of why you chose. So this, for me, is know-how. It's procedural. It's the ability of the learner to deploy language in order to achieve a communicative task outcome. And within that, for teachers, a lot of the work that will be done will be with helping the students to upgrade the language that they have and to perhaps fill gaps in terms of language that was missing. On the other hand, you have courses, and we see this a lot in course books, but also in exam-driven situations where there are predefined learning outcomes. At the intermediate level, you will be able to distinguish between the present perfect simple, I have studied, and the present perfect continuous, I have been studying. It's very much, and I use Thornberry's term of a grammar McNugget, a little bit of learning you can go and study today. It's very much focused on a particular bit of target language. Today we're doing the present perfect. It's about then enabling students to take that declarative, know about side of language. I know that the present perfect is used for this and it's made of these bits, and helping them to start to activate it. And therefore it has a focus on target language. And this, I think, is very common around the world. But of course, many of us know that if you do only this, the chances are that the day after the students have studied that bit of language, that little bit of McNugget, that they don't remember it at all. The arrow here is to make the point this isn't a polar one or the other. There are many shades in the middle, and that's the reality of most classrooms. So how does this link to different types of syllabus? Well, I'm going to suggest that a holistic task-driven syllabus with a focus on emergent language and on learners being able to achieve a communicative task really relates to the analytic syllabus, whereas the synthetic syllabus is much more about the coming together of the pieces of language, the Lego bricks, fitting them together so that hopefully that you have a strong building or a strong model. But of course, we all know that with both with Lego and more so with language, that quite often bits fall off and the structure isn't entirely strong. So in terms of what happens in classrooms, I think if we look at the analytic, holistic approach first, based on task, then the students at any level, and therefore also including C2, are going to benefit from massive amounts of comprehensible input, listening and reading, and that input then becomes intake. In terms of second language acquisition, the students not only can make sense of it, comprehensible, but it then makes it becomes part of the language that they can process and begin to use, perhaps initially by understanding, and then perhaps later on in terms of their production. So you might be looking at a reading text, and looking at the reading text in order for the students to have this massive language bath, and for language to come out of the language text, perhaps at the choice of the learners. What language are you interested in here? Underline 5 bits of language which interest you. And they may pull out a piece of language that they're already familiar with, but they've not seen in this particular context, for example. And then it'll also, as an analytic syllabus, be characterized by scaffolded activities. And that's where the teacher comes in. They provide activities that enable the students to move from a sense of, I can't do this, I don't understand it, to independence step by step. Compare that with the synthetic syllabus. This is where the focus is on those little chunks of language, the present perfect today, the present perfect continuous later this week, chunks of target language that you see a lot in course books, most course books, and also in exam prep books. Now, in terms of the synthetic syllabus, further guidance in terms of the kind of language and the kind of functional ability that the learner is required to have. So, for example, in the C2 speaking exam for Cambridge, it's the ability to negotiate meaning, and to persuade other people to come to a conclusion. So language of persuasion, language of agreement and disagreement. And that information is often available, not just from the course books, but, for example, from guidance from exam boards. Cambridge, for example, makes available the C2 Teacher's Handbook, which also has sample answers. So why does this matter? Let me explain. Be it an emergent language analytic approach or a synthetic target language approach, which I think have been described in terms of classroom frameworks by task-based learning from Jane and Dave Willis here for the analytic emergent language approach, or by PPP, presentation, practice and production, for the target language activation approach. You as the teacher have, I think, an option to choose one, the other, or a fusion of the two. But when as teachers we are aware that these options exist, and when we therefore look at materials, course books, we can see what's happening. It perhaps enables us to have a better understanding of processes and the kind of processes which we want to, as the teacher expert, hopefully, bring to the classroom. So I'm now going to move on from this overview of syllabus design to look at materials. And for this, I've chosen two very, very different titles. One, rather wonderfully called Upside Down, published in Greece. And the second one, Ready for C2, which is a new C2 preparation course book written by Macmillan that was published very recently. They're on screen in this order because this one takes much more an analytic approach and this one is much more synthetic. Let's have a look and see what that looks like in reality. So this is 2 pages taken from Upside Down. And you can see it looks very different from your typical course book, I think. There's a QR code from which students can can actually access an article, and there are some leading questions, much as we would expect in a good, well-designed reading class. But notice the predomination of activities which relate to tasks. Very early on, the teacher can choose any or all of the following activities as a follow-up after the reading. So here we have that comprehensible, hopefully, input, followed by students in activities. Divide your students into pairs or small groups. Assign each group a different meaning of darkness from the text: mystery, fear, protection. Ask them to brainstorm words or phrases that they associate. And there, of course, comes in the recognition of the good language the students come up with, perhaps if it's not quite right, a reformulation, a recast of that language. We're in the realms of emergent language. There's lots of project work here as well. And I think it's important to say that in terms of working with emergent language, task-based frameworks are great, as I think are projects as well. That could be a topic of a whole separate session. But why am I talking about it now? Well, yes, emergent language, I've talked about it previously for gallery teachers. I'm a fan. It brings in extraordinary amounts of creativity for the learner. And it also brings in projects, which I think learners are motivated by. They see, they negotiate, they agree what their outcome is going to be, and they go on that journey and they negotiate the journey in order to achieve the outcome. They are using language for communication. They're not just learning bits of language. It's probably coming quite clear which of the two approaches I'm more interested in. But what I thought was really interesting is that the lady behind Glosso Books, Maria Davu, did some academic research. She's a PhD holder herself, looking at what happened with a group of students who were preparing for a C2 exam, Cambridge Proficiency, and one of the Michigan English language tests. And when they studied using the material that you can see on screen now, and if you I'll be able to put this in chat later, but if you look for Maria Davu and deep learning, you'll find her in a TED talk in Patras in Greece. She found out that in a pilot group of 150 students, that when they came to the end of the emergent language analytic syllabus approach and they did the exam results were in terms of C2 level passes, greater than 90% when they had been previously using exam preparation course books, which gave a pass rate of under 70%. And I think that's very interesting. I think it's also important to recognize that I'm not damning exam preparation course books. And in fact, what's interesting in this new Macmillan one, the Ready for C2, is that in fact, it sort of separates out into two halves, the language and skills development for the learners taking a C2 preparation program. Here on the left, you've got language. Here on the right, you have exam practice. So theoretically, as a teacher, you can make a decision, preferably in conjunction with your learners as part of a needs analysis, looking at, well, kind of at different points of the journey, which is more important. And very often these books are done unit by unit, week by week. So we can alter the focus. You might say this week we're going to be spending much more time on language in class. I'm going to be asking you to do the exam activities, the practice activities in your own time, or vice versa. So, and the point here, I think, is this, that while I have perhaps a preference for what we saw earlier, this analytic approach to helping the development of high-level language skills, I also have to recognize that there will be local contexts, student expectations, parent expectations, school Ministry of Education expectations that might make an entire program based on this difficult to achieve. And therefore, you may need to take a rather more of a synthetic approach. And notice here how the language is presented very much as kind of commodities. Again, a term used, I think, by Thornbury himself. So that brings me to the conclusions for today, which in many respects are a summary and a restatement of the issues that I have shared with you. So if we start at the top left and work across and then look at the points at the bottom, I really do want to question the assumption that some people still have that, and forgive me for using the term, but for the purposes of today, it's a handy one, that native English teachers are somehow automatically better. They are absolutely not. And there are two reasons, remember, for this. Number one, just because you're a native speaker doesn't make you a sophisticated or even a particularly good user of English, because different varieties of English, many of them don't conform to the expectations of standard English that we see in exams. So they would be presenting a model which, for exam purposes, is not helpful. And more importantly still, is that the skill that you are all developing, already have developed, as competent teachers, which is so much more than language knowledge. Number two, I've argued in favour of the needs analysis, and for it from it moving out of the space for one-to-one and business and ESP contexts to be a tool that is used in great detail, lighter touch, depends on the specific class that you're working with, be it an individual or more likely a group. But nevertheless, it can illuminate so much about the journey that the students are wanting to go on. And the results of that needs analysis, number three, should help us to consider what it is and that is going to be the learning basis of any course. Someone who tells you, I don't want to do an exam, I just want to be able to use English better, for me is already an invitation to explore analytic type syllabuses. Someone who is absolutely focused, I want to pass the C2 Proficiency exam, Cambridge, Michigan, whatever. I need a course book. I need to be taken through the steps. They're probably going to be more comfortable with a synthetic syllabus based around a course book. Doesn't mean to say that you can't move in either direction, but it gives you a starting point. Is it possible to only ever use an analytic syllabus? In many ways, I'd be really interested in seeing that happening. It has been argued by Jeffrey Jordan that we should be doing that, but I think there are commercial reasons why we're probably a long way from that being possible. Then down to the bottom, I think and let's be honest, it takes a skills exam teacher to avoid monotony setting in at some time. So I believe that even in exam courses, the introduction of task-based learning, TBLT, task-based learning and teaching, PBL, project-based learning, and DL, deep learning, that we saw in that book, all of which can be very useful at a range of levels. Yes, the book that you saw upside down is actually for B2 levels and higher, because the teacher can tune the language accordingly. I'd incorporate that into all courses, and as an approach, and I'd also be thinking about having elements of task-based learning and project-based learning very low level. But finally, let's be realistic. I hope that now at the end of this session, you feel a little bit more informed, a little bit more confident about what it means to teach C2. and that some of the elements that can contribute to that awful imposter syndrome really don't belong in our teacher persona. Here I've included some of the suggested reading. They're also available on the GT website. Some of these texts have informed the writing of today's webinar, today's masterclass. But can I just remind you that today's session is just one part of a really rich library of previous masterclasses by some of the real greats in ELT. And if you'd like access to those, the full recordings, then we would like to invite you to consider taking up Pro membership. There are many benefits of this. More than 100 workshops, rather like this one. Live events, you automatically are able to attend the live events with Pro membership, plus other benefits including safeguarding refresher courses, TEFL refresher courses. So do consider signing up. Thank you very much indeed for being part of today's masterclass. Bye-bye.